Okay, picture this for a second. Two people meet, they fall in love, and they decide to get married. One of them is a German citizen, and the other is Chinese. Sounds like a really beautiful, simple human milestone, right? But beneath all that exciting wedding planning lies a completely wild, incredibly complex legal maze. Think about it. If they get married in Germany, or if they tie the knot in China, or even if they go to a third country altogether like Denmark, whose laws actually govern their marriage? Whose rules apply to the house they buy, their individual rights, or, worst case scenario, their divorce? The answer is absolutely not simple. And honestly, getting to the bottom of it is going to take us on a really fascinating journey through centuries of history, deep-rooted philosophy, and some major legal evolution.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into this amazing intersection of history, culture, and cross-border relationships. We'll be looking directly at a deep dive analysis of international private law. We're going to decode exactly how the legal systems of two vastly different nations, Germany and China, collide, clash, and interact when their citizens decide to say "I do."
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the international marriage puzzle. Trace China's historical shift from openness to isolation, examine the modern sovereignty obsession, look at some major hurdles, and finish up by discussing how the system is being reformed.
Section 1. The International Marriage Puzzle. All right, to really get what's happening with our German-Chinese couple, we first need to lay down a little bit of basic terminology. We need to know exactly what triggers this massive collision of two completely different national rulebooks. Basically, we're dealing with international private law, which legal folks often just abbreviate as IPR. But what actually activates IPR? Well, it's this concept called Auslandsberührung, a German term that essentially translates to foreign contact. A legal situation has foreign contact whenever at least one person involved is a foreign citizen, or when assets are located in another country, or when a legal event like signing a contract or, in our case, a wedding ceremony happens across borders. So the very second our German and Chinese citizens decide to get married, boom, we instantly have foreign contact, and international private law has to step in to figure out which country's laws apply.
Section 2. From openness to isolation. Now, you might be thinking international law is a purely modern invention, right? Well, actually, if we look at China's legal timeline, we see these absolutely massive pendulum swings in how open it was to the outside world. It's this incredible story of early, vibrant global integration, followed by some deeply traumatic isolation. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because this history directly shapes how Chinese law views our hypothetical cross-border couple today.
We're going to start way back in the Tang Dynasty. Think about this number for a second, 100,000. That is the staggering estimated number of foreigners who lived in just two major Chinese cities, Chang'an and Guangzhou, back in the Tang era. China was incredibly integrated into the global scene back then, mostly through the Silk Road. Foreigners were buying land, running businesses, and yes, marrying local Chinese citizens.
And get this perfectly captures the legal vibe of that era. This quote comes straight from the Yonghui Code, which was enacted all the way back in 651 AD. It basically says that if two foreigners from the exact same place get into a dispute, they are judged by their own home country's laws, not by Chinese law. Legal scholars will tell you this is arguably the world's very first international private law norm. I mean, that is just an unbelievable level of ancient accommodation for foreign legal systems. But as history often reminds us, that kind of openness doesn't always last.
Fast forward to the 16th century during the Ming Dynasty, and that pendulum swings hard. Faced with all these frequent, violent attacks from Japanese pirates along its coastlines, China had to pivot. The emperors essentially locked things down, rolling out a really strict policy of self-isolation. Borders were closed, a lot of international trade was totally cut off, and the idea of applying any foreign law on Chinese soil, absolutely, strictly rejected. The fear of external threats literally caused China to bolt its doors.
And sadly, that isolation really just set the stage for a period of immense trauma. After the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, China was forced into what historians call the semi-colonial period. Foreign powers basically bullied China into accepting these things called consular courts. What did that mean? Well, if a foreigner committed a crime or had a lawsuit inside China, they weren't tried by Chinese judges. Nope, they were tried by their own foreign consuls. So for over 100 years, China essentially lost its own legal sovereignty over the foreigners living inside its borders. You can only imagine the profound psychological and legal scar that kind of thing leaves behind on a nation.
Then, the legal system faced another devastating collapse much later on during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. For an entire decade, the legal system was pretty much wiped off the map. Studying or applying foreign law wasn't just frowned upon, people literally viewed it as actively selling out the nation. It was a complete, total legal void. And because of this, China effectively had to hit the reset button on its entire international private law system, starting completely from scratch in the 1980s.
Section 3. The sovereignty obsession. So the crucial point is, how does a century of lost jurisdiction and historical trauma translate into today's legal philosophy? Well, when our modern-day German-Chinese couple goes to tie the knot, they're actually standing right in the middle of two systems that value completely different things. German international private law is super focused on the individual parties. It's always looking for the most just, fair outcome for the people involved, usually by applying whatever law the couple has the closest personal connection to. But Chinese international private law, it heavily prioritizes state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because of all that trauma we just talked about, bringing foreign law into a Chinese court is still viewed with a lot of deep, deep suspicion.
And that suspicion results in what experts call lex fori dominance. Lex fori is just a fancy Latin term that means the law of the forum, basically the local law. Because Chinese law has this really deep-seated instinct to throw a protective shield over its sovereignty, it heavily defaults to just applying its own rules to international family disputes. So if our couple unfortunately ends up in a Chinese court for a divorce, the judge is almost certainly going to apply Chinese law, pushing German law to the side just to protect that state's sovereignty.
Section 4. Modern hurdles and missing laws.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how these historical fears create massive institutional roadblocks for couples today. Right now, China actually doesn't have one single unified international private law code. The rules are totally piecemeal. They're scattered all over the place, in general civil principles, specific little statutes, and random judicial interpretations from the Supreme Court. And sometimes these scattered rules literally conflict with each other. Throw in that lex fori dominance we just talked about, and you've got a system that is incredibly frustrating and unpredictable for international families to navigate. But honestly, there's an even bigger systemic flaw we need to talk about.
Check this out. 2.3%. That tiny number represents how much international private law is actually tested on the Chinese National Judicial Exam. Out of 600 total points on the exam, IPR accounts for maybe 14 points. Why does that matter for our couple? Well, it means the vast majority of local judges out there have virtually no awareness or training in international law. Since they're basically taught to default to local Chinese law anyway, they just aren't equipped to untangle complex foreign legal concepts. That leaves our couple completely at the mercy of a judge who might not fully grasp the international reality of their marriage.
Section 5. Reforming the system.
But hey, the story definitely doesn't end there. Chinese legal scholars are acutely aware of these systemic flaws, and they're actively fighting to modernize the system so it actually works for today's globally connected society. Right now, though, they are locked in a pretty intense academic battle over how to actually implement the reforms. On one side, led by the Chinese IPR Research Society, you have folks advocating for a completely standalone, independent IPR code. They call it the Vorel IP. Their argument is that international law is so incredibly unique and procedurally dense that it simply needs its own dedicated rulebook, just like a lot of other countries have. On the flip side, some members of the Civil Code Drafting Commission argue that IPR should just be a dedicated chapter woven right into the new Unified Chinese Civil Code. They call this the IPR Code. For them, it's all about being pragmatic. They think this is just a much faster way to get the rules onto the books so courts can start handling the massive boom in international cases.
So, what does this all mean for the future? As China pushes forward, drafting its unified codes and reforming its laws, how on earth is it going to balance this heavy historical instinct to protect its sovereignty with the unavoidable modern reality of global integration? For our German-Chinese couple and literally millions of other cross-border families out there, the outcome of this academic debate isn't just some legal theory. It's going to directly write the rules for their lives, their assets, and their futures. It really leaves you pondering, how will ancient history continue to dictate the deeply personal lives of modern global citizens? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped decode what is honestly a truly fascinating legal puzzle.